A few months ago, I had a look at Mastertronic as a company and concentrated a fair bit on their failed venture into the arcades, the Arcadia Super Select system, an intriguing subject, one that the almighty Neil over at RMC's also covered recently, trying to restore an example. This Mastertronic video is more about the games, 10 of them to be precise, but these are all ZX Spectrum titles that were my childhood favourites from the big old budget studio growing up, the ones that I remember playing and enjoying the most. Because, well, let's face it, there are a lot of Mastertronic games and most of them were released on multiple platforms, so covering them all at once would be pretty damn difficult. So instead, these are my favourites from childhood, a big old slab of nostalgia. Now, this isn't meant to be the absolute best Mastertronic games in any way. Quite a few of these aren't exactly amongst their most famous titles, and you will find that a lot of their most famed games are missing. For example, I never played any of the Finders Keepers games when I was a child, so if you come here expecting Spellbound or Nighttime, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. Indeed, just because these are childhood favourites doesn't necessarily mean they've held up nowadays. But it'll be a pleasant trip down memory lane. A good chunk of these are games that I still enjoy, and they're all games that were originally published by Mastertronic. While there's a good few re-releases of full-price titles from the studio that I loved back in the day, I'm sticking with their original budget line. So let's get on with it. We start things off with a quite odd game that's got a bit more horror than what you would usually find on the Specky. Here's Werewolves of London from 1987. This is a very odd game in many ways. Made by Steve Howard and Paul Smith, aka Viz Design, this is definitely a game best played on the Amstrad CPC, seeing as that was the lead version and was also fully finished. This Specky version was converted by other people and is not fully finished. The game will crash when you complete it instead of giving you an ending. According to an interview Howard did with Dreamcatcher, a lot of this was down to happenings at the company that was supposed to release the game, Areola Soft. They filed for bankruptcy right around the time that it was finished, meaning that this Specky version, which was originally supposed to be a full-price release on Specky, eventually came out as a budget game from Mastertronic over a year after it was supposed to come out, well after the CPC and C64 releases. Areola Soft had also released Viz Design's previous game, the also horror-themed Bride of Frankenstein, and this title is naturally more of a riff on American Werewolf in London, with a splash of Warren Zevon. The game's named after his son, and the title music is basically a beeper cover version. Another weird thing to mention here, just as we're looking at this absolutely beautiful Your Sinclair preview, is the existence of something called the Werewolf Rap. This is actually a not too bad hip-hop instrumental, of all things, that mixes up the game's music a little, and I believe it could be found on the flip side of the original CPC and C64 cassettes. Unfortunately, you won't find it on the Specky version. The Mastertronic release is a flippy tape with the Specky version on one side and the CPC on the other. The wafer-thin premise of this title is that you've got a rather bad dose of lycanthropy, and now that you're doomed to roam the streets of London as a werewolf whenever night comes, you're going to take vengeance on the family that cursed you to this existence. There are 8 yuppies to kill and even eat. You pick up a cross from each of them, and the 8 crosses should rid you of the curse. Whenever you get near one of these folks, a cross will flash on the screen, although they also stand out by virtue of being dressed in black. Naturally, the police are all over the shop, and they're going to try and stop you either by jailing you or shooting you, and there'll be more of them plodding about with each murder you commit. It's kind of amusing though that even if you have quite literally just killed somebody right in front of a copper's eyes, your only punishment ends up being a night in the cells. The game only ends when you die, and there's a few items that can help you out along the way. Bandages heal bullet wounds, files get you out of jail early, and torches help you to see in the sewers. This is quite macabre indeed for a Specky game. It is kind of an open-worldish affair where you can actually set upon anyone you see if you wish, even if they are completely innocent, although you're generally better off just trying to take out those who you're actually supposed to, unless you're desperate for health and need to munch on some poor innocent. And I always found it smarter to try and run from the old bill rather than attempting to take them on. The game didn't review well at all on Spectrum, and unfortunately I can see why. A lot of Werewolves of London tends to involve waiting around and following targets as a human until night comes and you're finally able to attack them, and there's so many arcade adventure titles like this that are less monochromatic and much more diverse in their surroundings. And yet, despite everything, I still like this one as much as I did when I was a kid. Sure, it's mostly trudging through streets that all look the same with occasional trips into a park, the tube or the sewers, but it's got a bit of bad taste, a sort of atmosphere about it, and it still brings back good memories. Even if you should obviously play this game on CPC if you're going to, where you can find things such as actual in-game music and a lot more people milling about, not to mention colour, I still get a kick out of this version. Destructo, or The Island of Dr. Destructo, is an excellent shoot 'em up from the Bulldog label, released in 1987 and coded by Eugene Messina. Once again, this is originally an Amstrad title, but the Specky version is the one I've played, and it's a damn good game. A straightforward one where the clue to what you do is basically in the name. You fly your plane around and blow up other planes, sending them crashing to the floor where an enemy battleship or island or other such fortification is located. The aim is to make enough holes in the structure so that it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. There's 21 levels in total, and while the first couple start out very easy, it's not long before you have to face a whole load of enemy planes that will either crash into you or try and blast you out the sky. The game got some pretty average reviews from mags at the time, which is a bit of a shame, because I still really like this, and it plays like a very hectic single-screen Time Pilot, which is good, seeing as Time Pilot's one of my favourite arcade games. Annoyingly, playing the Amstrad CPC version does make me a little envious. It is undeniably much better on there, what with having far superior graphics, smoother movement, and some really great sound. Much better than either the Specky's rather limp beeps or the fact that even when the sun's out on the Spectrum, it is still perpetually nighttime. Still, this was the version I had, and it is still definitely a winner for me. A great arcade type game, and it was only $1.99. There's also an unofficial sequel to Destructo, a Russian game called Mini-Fly from 1994. This one's a bit worse, I'm afraid, as while there's a bit more colour and some catchy in-game music, the movement's a lot slower and much more basic than it is in Destructo. So yeah, while I thought I would mention this total obscurity, you should definitely stick with the original. Here's Kikstart II from 1988, a game based on the old BBC trial biking show Kikstart, although it's not actually an official licence, hence why the name is a teensy little bit different. Sean Southern's original Kikstart from 1985 never came out for the Specky, instead arriving on platforms like the C64 and Atari 8-bit, but this sequel did make it to the Spectrum alongside the other platforms. And yes, once again, the Specky is not the lead platform. Sean Southern worked on the main C64 version, and this was converted by Icon Design to the Specky. Once again, it's hard to look at that C64 version and not feel a whole load of jealousy. It's got music, it's got the movement, it's absolutely one of the best budget titles that you can find, an early game from a guy who's later going to do incredible things like Supercars and Lotus 2. The Spectrum version obviously cannot compare. There's absolutely no sound, and the bike controls are kind of broken in that the movement and obstacles gets very screwy a lot of the time, and even if you're in midair you can still jump on absolutely nothing, so long as you haven't already pressed the jump button. So yeah, that's all a bit odd. And yet I still love this. It does feel like a strange forefather of the classic Trials series of games where you're racing either against the computer or a mate over 5 courses. You've got the ability to create your own tracks if you want, and the race can still get pretty intense at times. Admittedly, if you're against the CPU, this largely depends on the tracks that have been selected, as there are some that they're brilliant on, and others where they are totally useless. Even if this is so utterly basic compared to the masterful Commodore release, and even if there are so many faults, I didn't know that back in the day. This was a childhood favourite, and I will always get a big kick out of it. I'm here all week. Rockford. I already mentioned this one back when I did the video all about Arcadia, seeing as Rockford was supposed to be one of the 2 launch titles for the arcade alongside Road Wars, but eventually the arcade version of this game never ended up coming out at all. This here is the Spectrum version that originally hit the shelves in 1987 on the MAD label, or Mastertronic Added Design, and gee, well, this is one of the first games that I ever remember playing. I'm never entirely sure just what the first Specky game I had was when I got the system in 1990, but this was definitely one of the earliest ones. Anywho, this is a Balderdash game, one that clearly has a license, seeing as Rockford is the name of the character in First Star's 1984 original, which is also mentioned in the inlay. You have 5 different characters and worlds to choose from: the Hunter, Cook, Cowboy, Astronaut, and Doctor. Aside from the sprites, the main difference in the worlds lies in challenge, with the Hunter's levels being the easiest and the Doctor's being the toughest. There's 4 levels per character, 20 in total, and a lot of gems to collect. This is certainly the first Balderdash type game that I played, and it's a formula that I usually enjoy a lot, so it's not a surprise that Rockford here still gets a big thumbs up from me. It's certainly got a bit of challenge about it, especially in the later levels, and some of them do require you to do the odd different thing, such as when the Doctor has to create a path for both oil and fire to meet each other and cause a big explosion so he can get through a wall. It's a simple game in many ways, but having played a fair few Balderdash type games on the Specky over the years, I still think that this is one of the better ones kicking around. It's totally natural to follow up the appearance of Rockford with this game right here, Rockman from 1985, and not just because the names are very similar. When you bought Rockford, you also got this game on the flip side. Not a bad deal at all for £3, especially seeing as this game is also quite good. The aim of the game is similar to Rockford in that you have to collect things once again, mushrooms in this instance, but this is a bit more like a platformer, one where our hero can also use his hammer to knock down rocks, clearing a path, and also bonking ghosts with them. In short, it's kind of a hybrid. There's a bit of Balderdash, but also a bit of Lode Runner. I really like this one. It's quite in your face, especially with the bright colours and sound effects, and it does have a nice kick to it, with plenty of these single screen levels being real head scratchers that will often have you reaching for the restart button. The movement is a little bit gritty, just like Balderdash. Sometimes that can be annoying in a game like this, although you soon get used to it. It's a very likeable game, really. I still enjoy this, and both this and Rockford are also amongst the very few games that my parents enjoyed at all, which is a little bonus. Also, there is actually a bit of pedigree behind the game, and a name you may possibly know. Rockman is the first game created by a then 15-year-old Dean Carter, who went by the nickname the Smiling Assassin. Dean would also work on the 2 Druid games for Firebird later in the 1980s, before joining Bullfrog in the mid-90s, and he's best known for his work with his brother Simon. Dean and Simon Carter were the co-creators and main designers of the original Fable, so they've certainly had a pretty big impact on games as a whole, and they're both still active in the industry today. And it all started right here with Rockman. It's not unlike an acorn that falls on the ground and grows into an oak tree, isn't it? After those 2 good games, here's something different. A pretty generic game that I remember enjoying a lot when I was a kid, but haven't played in probably about 25 years, not until now and making this here video. Alas, this isn't one that's held up well at all, but I didn't really expect it to. This is Speedboat Assassin, a 1989 game from the Mastertronic Plus label, developed by Binary Design. In this instance that means Danny Whelan and Ben Jackson, who also worked on a bunch of Specky and other 8-bit ports of Arcadia games and others, ranging from R to Road Wars, not to mention the Spectrum port of Double Dragon. There's not a lot of info here, but Danny Whelan was a long-time friend of Steve and John Pickford, who we'll be seeing more of soon, and unfortunately he passed away far too young in 2009, aged 42. Now, as I say, this game hasn't held up too well. It's not terrible in the slightest, but it's just the sort of thing that the Specky doesn't do that well, being that it's an arcade shooter type game set on the water, where you simply dodge mines and take down towers, enemy ships and the like. It's a 16-bit type game, only on the 8-bits, that's generally competent, but lacks character. For £3, it's acceptable. Amusingly enough, this Specky version is actually better than the Amiga original. That one is absolutely awful, and hated by most anyone who played it. Whelan and Jackson didn't do that one, by the way. There are a couple of curiosities here. This game reminds me the most of the likes of Atari's Hydra, not to mention the equally ban-average Bimini one on Mega Drive, although Speedboat Assassin actually predates both of those games by a year. I also wonder, what with the timeline and who developed it, if this game, or at least the 16-bit version, was ever considered for the Arcadia Super Select system, as it seems like the sort of thing that would have fit on there. A middling game indeed, but it's fun to have another look at these strange little things that your brain decides to keep in its memory banks. Speedboat Assassin is a pretty cool as hell title for a game, so maybe that's why I still remember it after all these years. Most of the games that we've covered in this video have been pretty obscure ones, but this next one definitely isn't. It's one of the signature works from a guy who already had a proven pedigree, is amongst the better known creators of Specky titles, and back in the day it was yours for all of $2.99. This is Gregory Loses His Clock from 1989, and one look at the graphics should immediately tell you that this is a game by the almighty Don Priestley, he of the likes of Trapdoor, Popeye, Minder, and Benny Hill's Madcap Chase. Indeed, Gregory Loses His Clock is actually Priestley's final game. He decided to return to teaching following its creation, as he felt that game development was moving more towards team efforts, as opposed to the individual creation that he preferred. So what we have here is essentially the culmination of all of Priestley's efforts, of his signature style, refined through all the other, mostly classic games he did up to this point. And the result isn't just Don Priestley's final game, it's also his best game. Considering that Don mostly worked on licensed titles in his career, it's great to have a wholly original game like this one. Gregory Loses His Clock is Priestley without any form of restriction, and the result is as wild as you might expect. The premise here is that Gregory, our perfectly ordinary hero, goes to sleep and his timepiece gets stolen and broken into 5 pieces by ghosts, and now he has to venture into several sections of the dream world in order to get the pieces back so he can get it restored and wake up. This is the classic sort of Don Priestley game, really. An item-based puzzler where you have to complete tasks in order to get those pieces back, whether it's fixing a bunch of leaks or finding the original paintings in an art gallery. The movement is much like other Don Priestley games in that it is slow, but then that's what you expect in a Specky game with sprites that are this big, and it's a small price to pay for the game being so lovely to look at, everything so full of life and colour. Don Priestley's style is so instantly recognisable, and Gregory Loses His Clock is the best example of it, for my money. There is also the odd bit of platforming and duking it out with enemies here, and again, even if these aren't perfect or as sharp as you would find in an arcade-style game, it's cool to see a game of this style trying to do it. You sense that this is Priestley pushing his style about as far as it can go on the spectrum. This is rightly quite the celebrated title, and if you're not familiar with the work of Don Priestley, I'd say that this is actually probably the one you should play first. It's a definite classic and a great introduction. Certainly better than Benny Hill's Madcap Chase at any rate. We move from one game based on time to another, although this one is a bit more straightforward. Chronos, A Tapestry of Time, is a shoot-'em-up from 1987, yours for a measly $1.99, and while it's not usually thought of as amongst the Spectrum's best, it's one of the first space shooters that I ever played. A trio called the Radical Tubes made this game, and they consist of 3 youngsters. You've got the Tatlock brothers, Stephen and John, responsible for the coding, design and art. John Tatlock will soon go off to become an artist at Software Creations in Manchester straight from school, and while I'm not sure if Stephen joined him there, the third guy in the team certainly did. The musician. Said musician is the man, the legend, the Tim Follin. Even if there wasn't also a game here, this would be worth loading up just for the opening music. This incredibly spacey creation that somehow, through some sort of process of alchemy, is coming out of a single channel beeper. This music sounds as if it's from another world. It sounds impossible. Genuinely one of the most staggering things I've heard on a specky, and Follin would do this on a few other titles, including Agent X 1 and 2, both of which were also made by Stephen and John Tatlock, and were pretty close to being included here. Once you finally press the any key and make your way into the game itself, you're greeted with something that's not quite as amazing as that opening music, but is still good all the same. Chronos is actually not a bad entry-level sort of shoot-'em-up, so it certainly served a purpose for me back in the day. The game is like one big level split up into 6 zones, with no pesky multi-loading interrupting the experience, and while there's no power-ups or anything, a lot of the enemies are pretty basic when it comes to movement. The game itself is monochrome, with background colours that change between zones, occasionally into something less palatable, but the art here is good, and there is room for the odd cute reference here and there. You know you're playing a British specky game when Jethro Tull gets randomly inserted into one of the zones. You make your way through the zones and, kind of like Scramble, a lot more of the challenge often comes from making your way through tricky corridors and narrow passages as opposed to the enemies themselves, and eventually you face a final boss that moves like the old DVD screensaver. Beat that, and Chronos himself gives you a little message before sending you over to the next loop. Reviews for this game were largely average, with most criticism being over the game being pretty generic more than anything, but this was a pretty cool introduction into the world of shoot-'em-ups for me. Sure, I probably could have made a better pick from the corner shop shelves, but I certainly could have picked worse. Our last 2 games are the sort that are most assuredly still gems, regardless of how old they are. This one's the almighty 180, the greatest darts game ever made. I did do a short video on this game several years ago, but it bears repeating. This little title, with the disembodied hand flying around the board, is still the king of the whole genre, the virtual titan of tungsten. A couple of familiar names worked on this 1986 title. The code and design was taken by Gary Hughes, who's got a good bunch of credits over the span of 30 years in the industry, and the art was thanks to a young Steve Pickford. Again, we'll get to him and his bruv more on the last game in the vid. Obviously this game is all about the errors, so the premise should be pretty bloody obvious, but 180 can be enjoyed either with a mate, through a quick round-the-clock tune-up, or by facing off against 3 computer opponents. The first 2 are randomly selected, and the third one is always Jammy Jim. Annoyingly, the TZX version I have here only ever picks Delboy Desmond and Devious Dave, but there's also the likes of Beerbelly Bill, Limp Wrist Larry, and Tactical Tell kicking about. Jammy Jim, the final opponent, is naturally the hardest. You can only beat him by hitting a 9-dart finish, although you only have to do it once. The art style is absolutely wonderful. It's classic British comic stuff, the sort of thing that reminds me a lot of Viz, especially when the opponent's throwing and it's matched with the ridiculously catchy music, courtesy of the great David Whittaker. Still one of my favourite games, this one, and yes, still the best darts game. For many people, the only other computer title that can match this one is Wacky Darts by Codemasters. That's also really good, and it's also by Gary Hughes, so in many ways that's an unofficial sequel to 180. I do prefer the original, but it's nice to know that Gary Hughes has what many people would consider the number 1 and number 2 best darts games ever made on lock. And so we come to the final game of the vid, and happily, it's a very good one. A stylish game full of character that goes way beyond the £2.99 price tag. This is Zub from 1986, and it's the first game to be co-designed officially by the almighty Steve and John Pickford, aka the Pickford brothers, both still very active in the world of games today and responsible for titles like Feud, Glider Rider, Plock, Wetrix, Naked War, and plenty more besides, and here they're doing their first game together under the wing of frequent Mastertronic dev studio Binary Design. There's two versions of this, but naturally we're going with the 128K version here as that's pretty clearly the one to go for. Originally this game was supposed to be called Zob, but the title was altered when it was discovered that Zob is a French slang term for cock. Either way, Zub is a game about an alien private named Zub who is recruited by King Zub and promoted to Sergeant Zub to retrieve the green eyeball of Zub, one of the crown jewels, located somewhere in the Zub solar system. The plot, all found in the inlay, is actually quite funny, certainly a whole lot more than you usually get in an 8-bit budget title. The Pickfords liked to create comic books and designs in their teenage years, having a few pics printed in the pages of 2000 AD, and that's something they still do today. The character also extends to the fabulous James Bond parody and intro, and the title screen. Again, there's lots going on here. And happily, none of this flashy design and animation compromises the game itself. It's a really cool title where the levels consist of jumping onto platforms, moving to the next one above, and continuing until you reach the end of the level at the top. Naturally there's aliens that will try to knock you off these platforms, and Zub has a blaster to try and take care of them. You do get bonus points if you shoot accurately, so try not to get too gung-ho if you care about score. This game has one of the best chickenometers going. Zub gradually turns into a skeleton as he takes damage, and obviously the game's over if he becomes fully skeletal. The game kind of feels like an evolution of the old Imagine game Jumpin' Jack when it comes to finding your way up a stage through the use of these platforms, although I find Zub to be a lot less frustrating than that title. The character really helps it along, and there's also excellent music that plays throughout. This is courtesy of David Whittaker, and it's another thoroughly catchy track that's amongst my favourites of his. There's even room here for an Easter egg, a whole other game. Entering a code allows you to play a little shoot 'em up called Light Farce, a purposefully clunky affair knocked up in an afternoon, seemingly on the day before Zub's deadline, as a bit of a piss take of FTL's Light Force, which was getting a lot of rave reviews at the time. This was also released on a Sinclair user cover tape a little later on, under the name of Zarjas. There's so much cool little stuff to be found here, so much that people wouldn't generally accept out of a budget title. But then that was the ideal for these games. When the likes of Mastertronic boss Martin Alper proclaimed that the budget games they were releasing were more than a match for the full price titles, games like Zub were the sort that proved the point. This clearly isn't, as Jeff Minter once assumed of Mastertronic's library back when they first made waves, a dog end. Zub is a great little game, and a wonderful debut for one of British gaming's most iconoclastic duos. And with that, we finished looking at 10 Mastertronic games that were amongst my childhood favourites from the studio. Happily, even if some of them aren't necessarily the best versions of a title, most of these games have still held up pretty well for me, and there's still ones that I enjoy going back to, whether I'm playing them for a video, or just firing them up for no reason other than having fun with a good old specky game. I'm sure you have similar childhood faves, whether they're from the Spectrum or elsewhere, and I'm sure that that's something you'll shout about in the comments. Hopefully though, you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.